So why is resource rich as a trap? Here I'm going to move beyond the bottom billion, and I'm going to give you some new work. I've tried to simulate how the present commodity booms will play out based upon the global experience of the last 40 years. Right? Those of you who've read any of my work will be familiar that what I do is it's statistical. I look at global history and try and discern statistical patterns and regularities to the best of my ability. So what we find, we look to see how over the last 40 years an increase in commodity prices had played out in terms of economic growth and development in the resource exporting countries. First of all, we found Africa is no different from anywhere else, which is usually the result we get. Africa is distinctive in having a lot of natural resources, but not in behavior. So what we found was that in the short term, everything is hunky-dory. Right? Things go up. Right? They really go up. Right? You have booms. Income goes up, output goes up, everything goes up. Right? That's happening at the moment. Right? It's the predominant reason why Africa is now growing faster. So the short term just looks great. And then how about the long term? The long term, it depends. But if we take the typical country, the long term is not hunky-dory, it's Humpty Dumpty. That is to say, you fall off a cliff. So if we track the typical resource exporter in Africa and we run it through this global pattern, I'll just run you through GDP, national income. It goes from 100, or this is in terms of real output, relative to counterfactual. So we started at 100 now. By 2010, it's 110, so it's up 10% relative to counterfactual. By 2025, it's at 75. It's down 25% as a result of the commodity booms relative to counterfactual. A massive loss. So that instead of these huge revenues being harnessed for sustained growth, they actually become a disaster. So then look to see why. And the answer is, it turns out it's governance. 30 years ago, my profession, economics, thought it had the answer, which was Dutch disease. It's the thing the IMF fusses about. There's a sort of cycle in the IMF. When they can't think of anything else to fuss about, they fuss about Dutch disease. It's very minor, very minor. If you get the governance right, you ride out the Dutch disease. There's a threshold level of governance above which these resource booms are not just good in the short term, they're good in the long term. You go up in the short term, you go up even more in the long term. Norway. Norway's not been crippled by Dutch disease. It's the richest country in the world. And it didn't used to be. And that's true of all the resource-rich countries with good or reasonable governance, initial levels of governance. You need to get your institutions for governance before you get your resources. So there's this threshold level of governance. Where's the threshold? Well, to take a little country far away that isn't in Africa, it's Portugal in the mid-1980s. Is about at the threshold above which you harness things for the future, below which you go negative. Now, Portugal in the mid-1980s was about one of the weakest governance countries in Europe. Right? But what you've got to ask is, how does Portugal in the 1980s compare with, say, the Democratic Republic of the Congo now? Right? Because it's not Portugal in the 1980s that's getting this resource boom, it's the Democratic Republic of the Congo now. And the answer is pretty obvious, that most of the countries which are getting these resource bonanzas amongst the bottom billion currently have governance levels which, if history repeats itself, the short term will be hunky-dory and the long term won't.